rather than go through the additional time expense of ask the server to send me the JavaScript file, get the JavaScript file back, it's just looking locally to its own cache, which is faster to access, and just using that JavaScript file instead. And so, while that might be an annoying use case of caching, in practice it's actually quite helpful if we ever want to have some resource that is going to persist for some amount of time, something that we want to be kept inside of the cache because it's probably not going to change too often. And so, inside of an HTTP response, when the web server responds back to the user and presents it with the body of the response that contains the page to actually load, the server also responds with HTTP headers, information about the request that the client web browser, whether it's Chrome or Safari or something else, knows how to interpret and knows how to understand. And so one of those headers might be this cache control header. And what the cache control HTTP header is allowed to do is it's allowed to set, in the most basic case, a maximum age for the page. In other words, specify after this number of seconds, or in this case, 1 day, I believe, that's when you should, if you're requesting the page again, actually see if something has changed. But within this amount of time, the page probably hasn't changed, so don't worry about trying to access it again if you're trying to load the same page again. Just use the cached version of it. And so, by putting a line like this inside of your HTTP header, and web frameworks like Flask and Django have ways of allowing you to edit what goes into the header, and you can set those. And you can look at Flask or Django's documentation for looking at how to do that. But you can say to the web browser, go ahead and save this page in the cache for a day or so, such that if you come back in a couple hours, no need to contact the server again, which might add additional load to the server when it's unnecessary. Just go ahead and load that same page. So what problems can happen here with caching on the client side, having the web browser cache the page? Yeah? Yeah, sure. Certainly if the page changes sooner than this amount of time, then when the user tries to go back to that page, there is a good chance that they're still going to see the old page, that they'll get the old page and it'll load very quickly, but whatever the newer version was, they're not going to see it. And certainly there are ways around this. You can hard refresh the page, which usually is going to try and clear the cache and just say, really try and access the page by actually talking to the server. And so that's something you can do as well. But what about the case where maybe this is saying you can cache the page for a day? What if the next day the page hasn't changed? Or 3 days later the page still hasn't changed? Under this model, we would still go back to the server and say, you know, a day's up, so it means that I can't use the cache page anymore. I need to go to the server and ask for it again. But imagine if it's some big file, like it's a video or some other large file that might take a long time. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense if we were trying to re-download it again and again and again just because the cache was up. And so what's a way that we might be able to enforce this idea that the server can send new data if there's been a change, but doesn't need to? Yeah? Great, so we can use some kind of identifier, some identifier that's associated with the resource, whether it's a web page or a video or something else, where anytime that resource is updated, we update that header. And in HTTP, we call that header an E tag or an entity tag, which can just be a really long hexadecimal sequence or a sequence of numbers and characters, where that is going to be uniquely associated with a particular version of a resource. So if the resource gets updated, I update the page or I update the video, then this E tag is going to change. And so now, how can we use the E tag to implement caching, or to implement the idea that I don't need to re-download the page every time because of this E tag? What can I do? Yeah. Great, so when the user is trying to request the page, the user can send along the E tag with the request. Say, here is the E tag, here's the version of the request that I have, and the server can look at that E tag and say, does this match up with the latest version of the resource that I have on the server? And if it does match up, then rather than send the whole contents of the page, rather than send the whole video again, the server can just respond with usually a 304 status code. 304, which stands for not modified, just to say there's been no change to the content that you're trying to request. Go ahead and just use your cached version. It's still fresh, and it's not stale, as we'll often call it with regards to caching. And the result of that is the response can happen quickly, the server doesn't have to get too loaded, and the client can know the E tag is the same, the resource is the same, I can just use the version in the cache. Of course, on the flip side of things, if the user sends along an E tag with the request saying, I'm requesting this page, here's the E tag of the last time that I visited this page, if the page has changed and the server detects that, okay, wait a minute, this E tag is different from the E tag of the latest version of the resource, now the server knows that we need to give the user a fresh copy of that resource, and the server can now do that processing, get the resource, and deliver it to the user. And so this client-side caching serves two benefits, really. Number one is that it's faster for the user, that from the user perspective, they can often see the resource load faster because it's loading from their own computer as opposed to having to be transferred over the internet from one server to the client. And on the other side, it helps from the load perspective, that if you have hundreds of users that are all trying to access your server and access your database at the same time, anytime you can tell some subset of those users you don't really need to access the server or the database, you can just use the version of the site you already have, that's going to be a benefit to you. That's going to be less load on your website, that's going to help you as you think about scaling your website. Questions about client-side caching? All right, so let's talk about server-side caching now, which is another place where caches can be. And caches can exist all throughout this entire process, whether they're large or small, they can be located in different places. And one thing we didn't mention was that if you have a cache that's maybe works for your entire network, actually, we'll talk about that one more time. So imagine that you have some cache that's working for your local network, for instance, your computer and other computers that are all connected to the same network. What could go wrong with something like cache control or the E tag, where you might not want for the page to be cached? Security reasons, sure. That you might imagine that there's a difference between public websites and private websites, or private pages, that if Facebook.com, for instance, were something that were just consistently cached, then if I visited Facebook and saw my newsfeed and it was cached, then I wouldn't want it for if someone else on my network or someone else using my computer were to also go to Facebook, if they were to, on their account, if they were to also see the same contents of what I just saw because it was pulling from the cache. And so inside this cache control header, you additionally have the option of specifying, do I want this to be a public cache, meaning a page that anyone can see, or a private cache, which should be authenticated. And so there are additional settings inside the cache control that you can set in order to make sure the cache is behaving the way that you want it to behave. We won't go into too many of the details here, but know that you have that kind of control and flexibility over the cache just by setting it inside of the headers of the HTTP response that you're sending back to the user. But